Chapter 24. By Royal Command. Under the cover of the invisibility helmet, Pegasus flew above the security trucks all the way to Buckingham Palace. Riding on the horse's back, Elliot and Virgo looked out for Hypnos in case he tried to attack again, but there was no sign of the demon anywhere. 30 minutes later, they were peering through the windows of the Queen's London home. It was quite a view. They could see a maid pocketing some of the silver cutlery she was supposed to be polishing in the kitchen, and a footman trying on the Queen's dresses in the robing room. They found Queen Elizabeth II in her private parlour around the back of the palace. Dressed in an elegant white gown with a purple sash draped from her right shoulder to her left hip, the Queen was reading the newspaper and slicing a crumpet with the sword of state. The imperial crown sparkled brilliantly on top of her regal head. Elliot looked at the beautiful earthstone shimmering in the centre. The answer to all his problems. It was so close. Which meant Hypnos must be too. "What do we do now?" asked Virgo. "Shall we smash through the window?" "I think we'd better knock," said Elliot, unsure of the correct protocol for approaching the Queen of Great Britain on a flying horse. With Pegasus hovering steadily outside the window, Elliot leant over and tapped as politely as he could manage on the glass. The Queen looked straight at Elliot and Virgo, but returned to her paper. "We've just been blanked by the Queen," said Elliot indignantly. "And to think my Nan had a mug with her picture on it." "That invisibility helmet suits you," said Virgo with a sigh. "It matches your invisible brain." Elliot snatched off the helmet, making sure that Virgo received a good nudge in the ribs, took a deep breath, and knocked once more. The Queen looked up again. If she was startled to see two children on a flying horse outside her window, she had the good manners not to show it. Elliot smiled politely, and Virgo gave her an enthusiastic wave, which the Queen courteously returned with an elegant swivel of her wrist. Not taking her eyes from the window, she slowly removed her glasses and put her newspaper down on the golden tea table in front of her. She walked over to the window and opened it. "Good morning," she said calmly to her visitors. "May I help you?" Good morning, Your Majesty," said Elliot, attempting a clumsy bow on Pegasus's back. "Can we come in, please? We have something really important to ask you." "I see," said the Queen. "To whom does one have the pleasure of speaking?" "One is I'm Elliot," he said, quickly abandoning any attempt at talking posh. "Elliot Hooper. And this is Virgo. She's an immortal." "Hello, the Queen," chirped Virgo with a big grin. "How do you do?" said the Queen. "You'd better come in." As Her Majesty helped Elliot and Virgo to dismount from Pegasus and clamber through the window, Elliot became aware of an insistent snorting behind him. "And this is Pegasus," said Elliot as he landed on the soft carpet of the Queen's parlour. "He's a flying horse," he added, quickly realising that the Queen had probably worked that out for herself. "Your Majesty," said Pegasus grandly, dropping into an elegant bow. "Welcome, Mr. Pegasus," said the Queen, acknowledging his bow with a gracious nod of her head. "I can honestly say that you are the most magnificent horse I have ever seen." "I can honestly say that you are correct," said Pegasus, sweeping into another bow as Elliot leant out of the window and put the invisibility helmet over his white head to conceal him from view. Elliot and Virgo fidgeted awkwardly in the middle of the parlour as the Queen closed the window and turned to greet her visitors. "May I offer you some tea and crumpets?" she asked. "No, thank you. We don't have much time," started Virgo. "Oh, yeah," belted Elliot, whose stomach had been rumbling since the tower. "With some peanut butter, if you have some, please, Your Majesty," he trailed off, as a sub-zero look from Virgo reminded him that this wasn't really the time. "I'll see what I can do, Mr. Hooper," smiled the Queen, her eyes sparkling as she rang a small silver bell on the table. She sat back down in her chair, neatly repositioned her flowing white gown, and straightened the purple sash across her right shoulder. "Now," she said, folding her hands in her lap, "what can I do for you?" "Right," Elliot began slowly. "There's no easy way to say this, so I'm going to get straight to the point. That crown you're wearing contains a diamond that's really a chaos stone and has the power to control the earth. It's that one, there. Elliot reached out and pointed at the stone, his fingers tantalizingly close to his home's salvation. We need to take it so that a death demon called Thanatos can't get his hands on it, or the other 3 chaos stones, which we're also trying to find, and release his demon army and attack mortals and immortals with earthquakes and floods and fires and plagues and other really bad stuff. He sighed at the lunacy of his own tale. You think I'm insane and you're going to lock me up in the Tower of London, aren't you? The Queen calmly took a sip of her tea and stared intently at the young boy before her. Your tale is incredible indeed, Mr. Hooper, she said evenly. But you'd be surprised what one might believe from 2 children who have arrived on a flying horse. And for the record, I prefer to lock people up in Windsor Castle these days, she added with a twinkle. The heating's rather better. She picked up the small silver bell and rang it again. I can't think what's taking Jeffers so long. He's normally so prompt, she said, looking at the white double doors. Elliot wondered if Jeffers was the man they had seen in the robing room, who was probably struggling to undo the zip on the pink frock he'd been wearing a few minutes ago. But to return to your request, Mr. Hooper, do I understand correctly that you would like me to give you the Imperial State Crown so that you may guard this Earthstone from Thanatos? Said the Queen. Yes, said Elliot, slightly surprised that his garbled explanation had been that clear. We'd replace it, said Virgo, pointing at Hermes's bag. Oh, yes, said Elliot, plunging his hand into the bag, which seemed to go on forever before something met his grasp. We'd like to exchange it for this. He pulled his hand out with a proud flourish, expecting the new crown to be met with gasps of delight from the Queen. But upon seeing her politely confused expression, and hearing Virgo's groan, he looked more closely at what he had produced from the bag. In return for the priceless Imperial State Crown atop Her Majesty's head, Elliot Hooper was now standing in her private parlour, offering the Queen a large rubber chicken. Oh, sorry, he said, thrusting the chicken back in the bag. Virgo rolled her eyes. Elliot had another rummage around before pulling his hand out again, this time producing the replica crown. I meant this. Now the Queen gasped on cue at Hephaestus's astonishing work. The crowns were identical. May I? Asked the Queen. Sure, said Elliot, bringing the new crown to her, deciding a small curtsy would be appropriate as he handed it over. The Queen turned the replica Imperial State Crown in her hands, looking highly impressed. It's certainly much lighter than this old lump, she said, raising her eyes. I must admit I've never cared much for it. It's far too heavy. This is exquisite. Oh, and another thing, said Elliot, remembering the blacksmith's demonstration the night before. Hephaestus, that's the man, well, God, really, who made it, thought you might like this. Elliot placed the crown on the table in front of the Queen and pressed a large ruby on the side. The crown quietly started to rumble, a small wisp of steam twirling from the top for a few moments until there was a gentle ping. Elliot lifted the crown to reveal a small golden cup and saucer, which was filled to the brim with steaming tea. The sapphire on the back makes coffee, and every turn of the cross on the top will give you a lump of sugar, he said nervously as the Queen stared at the crown in amazement. Do you like it? I think it's quite wonderful, Mr. Hooper. But speaking of tea, what on earth has become of yours? This really is most unlike Jeffers, she said, insistently ringing her bell again. So, can we swap it for yours? Asked Virgo impatiently. We'll return the rest of the crown. Well, said the Queen, it's a little difficult. She was interrupted as a footman, whom Elliot presumed must be the delayed Jeffers, flung the white doors open with a flourish. Here's Jeffers, he sang, throwing his arms wide open. Jeffers, said the Queen cautiously, would you be so kind as to fetch my guests? Get it yourself, Granny, Jeffers laughed, looking from one crown to the other. I beg your pardon, said the Queen. Which one's got the Earthstone? Grinned Jeffers, holding out his hand. Give it. I can't say I care for your tone, Jeffers, said the Queen warily, rising to her feet. Whatever's got into you? "That would be me," screeched the footman, his face growing wings and wildness as he dissembled back into Hypnos. "Now hand over the goods, you wrinkly royal." If the Queen had any thoughts about her footman melting into a wing-headed demon, she kept them to herself. Elliot looked around the room to see what he could use to defend his elderly monarch. He had placed Her Majesty in great danger. It was down to him to protect her. "Give me the crown and I'll let you get back to your nap, Nana," winked Hypnos. "You'll have to get through us first," shouted Virgo, charging at Hypnos, hoping to knock him off his feet. But her small frame was useless against the demon of sleep, who picked her up and threw her against the wall like a used tissue. "Have it your way," Hypnos snapped at the Queen, pushing her aside to get to Elliot, leaving the monarch in a pile of lace petticoats on the floor. "I'll deal with you in a minute, Queen. First things first." Hypnos seized Elliot by the neck. Grabbing the nearest thing to hand, Elliot hit the demon with a gold cake stand, but he may as well have attacked him with a banana. Without even flinching, Hypnos lifted Elliot off the ground and started to choke him. "Thanatos says hi," he smiled, raising his trumpet to his lips. "Sleep well." "No, you don't!" screamed Virgo, running at the demon again, jumping on his back and smashing the Queen's teapot on his head. Hypnos dropped Elliot and the trumpet to the floor with a shriek, holding his burning head in his hands. Virgo kicked his trumpet away. "Playtime's over," he shouted, wiping scalding tea from his eyes. He walked menacingly towards the window that Elliot and Virgo were struggling to open, while Pegasus kicked at the glass. Hypnos reached them before they could make their escape, and towered over them, holding his fists aloft. "Sorry, kids," he winked as he drew himself up to put his full weight behind the blow. "This is gonna hurt." But at that moment, a heavy object flew across the room and smacked him hard on the back of the head. "Oi!" he shouted, spinning around to see what had clobbered him. "One doesn't think so, Hypnos," declared the furious Queen, her neat hair dishevelled where she had pulled the imperial state crown from her head and hurled it at the demon. "Prepare yourself for a right royal kicking." And with a great wrench, the Queen whipped off her full white dress to reveal a black ninja outfit beneath. Unencumbered by her gown, she leapt up into the air and backflipped across the room, hitting Hypnos square in the chest with a flying double-footed kick. Elliot and Virgo just had time to jump out of the way before Hypnos crashed against the wall, winded by the Queen's attack. Hypnos reached for his trumpet, but the Queen sprang off her back to her feet with a neat flick, spinning her purple sash around to expose 4 ninja stars on the back. She aimed them expertly at the demon, who defended himself with a priceless vase. When all 4 had been thrown, Hypnos retaliated by hurling the chipped vase at the Queen, who smashed it with a yell and a spinning kick on the heel of her court shoe. Hypnos ran at the tea table and threw it blindly at the Queen, but Her Majesty simply cartwheeled across the room and caught it, snapping it over her knee and twirling the golden legs threateningly at the demon. Elliot and Virgo watched with mouths the size of dinner plates as the demon of sleep and the Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, her other realms and territories, head of the Commonwealth and defender of the faith, circled around the room, neither taking their eyes from the other as they waited to see who would make the first move. Hypnos was the first to strike, with a clumsy lunge that the Queen easily sidestepped, thwacking the demon on the back with both table legs as he passed. But Hypnos recovered more quickly than she expected, and immediately lunged again, this time catching the Queen off guard and snatching one of her table legs. A furious duel began, Hypnos and the Queen fighting each other with table legs like swords, chips of wood flying everywhere as they thrust and parried around the room. "Elliot, duck!" cried Virgo, as another vase got caught up in the battle and hurtled towards Elliot's head, smashing against the wall behind him a split second after he dived out of the way. The frantic battle continued, Hypnos' brute strength an even match for the Queen's skilled swordsmanship. With an almighty swing, Hypnos blasted the table leg from the Queen's hand, forcing her to dive across the carpet to avoid being smashed by Hypnos' weapon. "Mr. Hooper," called the Queen politely as she ran up the wall and crouched on the top of a cabinet, "would you be so kind as to pass one the sword of state, please?" Elliot saw the ornate red and gold scabbard at his feet. He picked it up and threw it to the Queen. "Thank you so much," she said with a smile, catching the sword mid-air as she performed a flying front somersault from the top of the cabinet, mere seconds before Hypnos smashed into it. The two warriors paused for a moment on opposite sides of the room. The Queen unsheathed the sword of state to reveal the brilliant silver blade. She raised the sword above her head and prepared to charge. "Hypnos!" she bellowed, her eyes ablaze with fury. "Kiss one's royal bottom!" Ah! Her Majesty ran at the terrified demon, who raised a splinter of a chair leg to defend himself from the murderous monarch before thinking better of it and running away. The Queen chased Hypnos 3 times around the parlour, holding her sword above her head and roaring her terrifying battle cry. Hypnos tried to grab his trumpet, but the Queen was too fast. He made for the window and launched himself headlong at it. Wood and glass shattered everywhere as the demon of sleep threw himself outside, dissembled into a pigeon, and flew out of sight. Elliot and Virgo turned back to the demolished room, where the Queen was zipping up her white gown and smoothing the worst of her dishevelled hair. She picked up the 2 halves of her broken teapot. "I never really liked this set anyway," she said, as the real Jeffers burst into the room, still in the pink dress, but with a lump the size of an apple on his head. "Your Majesty!" he cried, taking in the destruction of the sitting room. "Are you all right, Ma'am?" "We are fine, thank you, Jeffers," said the Queen calmly. "But Mr. Hooper would like some crumpets and peanut butter. And we might need a new table." "Yes, Ma'am," said a confused Jeffers, who backed out of the room, rubbing his wounded head and trying not to trip on the hem of his dress. Elliot picked up Hypnos's trumpet and put it into Hermes' satchel. The Queen walked over to the original imperial state crown and handed it to Elliot. "I think you had better take this, Mr. Hooper. Clearly it could do great harm in the wrong hands." Elliot took the crown reverently in his hands. He'd got it. He could save Home Farm. "Thank you, Mum," he said quietly. "Sorry about the mess." "Don't worry about that," said the Queen, "and good luck finding the other stones. If I can be of any further assistance, you know where to find me." "Yes, Mum," said Elliot, as Jeffers reappeared with a plate of buttered crumpets and a silver pot of peanut butter. "Thanks." "Now, if you'll excuse me," said the Queen, "I must prepare for the ceremony. I can't possibly open Parliament with my hair like this." She extended a hand to Elliot and Virgo. "Goodbye, Miss Virgo. Goodbye, Mr. Hooper. I've a feeling we're going to be seeing a lot more of you." And with a regal smile, Queen Elizabeth II turned to leave the room, crunching over broken glass and china with every elegant step. "Your Majesty," Elliot said admiringly to her retreating figure, "you rock." "One knows," said the Queen with a wink. The rest of the Queen's day passed as planned, the state opening of Parliament proceeding without a hitch. Most observers wouldn't have noticed anything extraordinary as the Queen watched serenely over the proceedings, playing her regal role to absolute perfection. But towards the end of the ceremony, the keenest of eyes might not only have noticed the tiny curl of white steam escaping from the top of the imperial state crown, but also Her Majesty's contented smile at the thought of the lovely cup of Earl Grey she was going to enjoy in the carriage on her way home.